Here are first some general basic to-dos and to-don'ts. First, you don't want to twist the rig while you're recording. You can adjust where the rig is looking at in post if needed. With the 6 GoPro Freedom 360 rig, try to keep your subjects at least 3 feet or so away from the rig. It will save you in stitching later, trust me. But there are ways to save your footage that has subjects getting closer than that. It's just hit and miss and can take a lot of time. I'll cover that later though. A lot of people ask me a very important question: where to point the rig while shooting 360 video. Even though 360 video rig technically sees in all directions, where you point the rig is actually extremely important. If you angle the rig correctly, it will save you a lot of headache down the road when you're stitching. The process is simple. You want to determine the most important subject, wherever the direction it might be, in your view, and aim one of the cameras on the rig at that subject. On your standard GoPro, the field of view is just over 90 degrees vertically and just over 120 degrees horizontally, about 150 degrees diagonally. So the GoPro captures a very wide scene. Do your best to visualize that 90 and 120 degrees and get your subject inside that field of view. You don't need to get out a protractor or anything. I've never had any issues as long as I center my subject in one of the camera's field of view. That will help you later on in stitching. With 360 video, your choices as a cinematographer are quite limited. There's no framing your shot in the traditional sense. Like I've talked about before, you no longer have control over where your audience is looking. You do, however, have control over where they're standing and how tall they are. So you can basically ask yourself questions like, do you want to shoot right in the middle of the action? Or do you want to be a bit further back? Do you want to shoot right at eye level with your subjects? Or do you want to be taller, looking down on your subjects? Or maybe you want to feel really small looking up at them? Generally speaking, you'll want the camera in the center of the action, not at the sides or the back like regular cameras would be. But again, those rules can be broken, and you can always adjust and change things as your creative choices permit. Walk around the space you're shooting in. Use your eyes, be observant. Find places in your scene that look interesting and have meaning from all 360 degrees. Spin around in the same spot on your y-axis and look around in every direction. This is a whole new way of thinking about and visualizing cinematography, but it's really exciting and fun too. This may sound obvious, but people often forget to do that. Especially seasoned filmmakers who are used to looking for only one beautiful frame per shot. Every single direction from where you place the camera rigs needs to be interesting. You can, of course, choose to make only one part of your 360 degree interesting for emphasis or for other creative decision purposes, but keeping your video interesting should be of primary intent. Now, static versus moving or kinetic shots. Static is easier to stitch than kinetic shots for moving, and moving shots, for obvious reasons, can be much more engaging to watch, but also a little bit more difficult to stitch. So here's some tips when you're doing both. When you're moving, be as smooth with your motions as possible. You can move quickly, but just don't be jerky. With GoPros especially, jerky movement will be the death of your shot. The rolling shutters and small sensors on GoPros can't handle that kind of movement. My general rule of thumb is to shoot coverage of everything in a static setup, as well as whatever moving shots I want, just in case those moving shots don't work out for me. Be creative with the placement of your rig. You don't have to just decide between setting up your rig on a tripod or holding it and moving around. You can always mount the rig to a person in a third-person perspective way, or the front back of a motorcycle, or while you're walking, or to a surfboard, etc., etc. Always be thinking of new perspectives to experience your story in 360. With 360 video, you can't control where your viewer is looking during the video. You can control the very beginning, obviously, where they start looking, but once they've started the video where you've placed the camera and where you've placed the frame, you can't really change or adjust where the viewer is looking. They're pretty much on their own. So a really good question to ask as a cinematographer with 360 video is to say, how can I control where my audience is looking, right? How can I guide their view? So the best way, and some techniques that I've learned in the past, is one of the first things is when you're doing kinetic movement, right? If you're holding your tripod or your rig, and let's say you're walking in a line somewhere, right? What I have found that, usually speaking, you obviously can't say as a blanket statement, but when you're walking from one place to the next, usually the direction in which you're traveling is where the viewer will be drawn to look. So if you're walking this direction, for instance, so if I were walking towards the camera right now, basically the viewer would want to and sort of be drawn to look ahead as they're moving forward. They'll also, of course, explore, look behind themselves, up, down, things like that. But if you're wanting them to look at something, it's good to go in the direction in which you want them to look. Another good way to do it, especially if you're shooting in a static setup, is to add choreography, right, to your shot. Have your subjects move from like A to B in order to draw them from here to over there. So if you're following somebody, they can guide the viewer to wherever they need to look. Also, you can, of course, if you're talking directly to the rig, you can say, okay, over there is something, over here is something. You can actually literally point the viewer in whichever direction that you feel they should go. All right, let's talk about audio. Audio is forgotten far too often. Without solid audio and a good mix, your 360 video will lose a lot of its impact. Great visuals are important, of course, but without good audio, especially with a medium like 360 video, when you're trying to immerse the viewers in the environment, you will get, at best, 50% of the quality you would have gotten if you'd recorded solid audio in the first place. In a nutshell, never, ever, ever use the GoPro's audio for the final sound. Record audio with an external recorder like the H4n or even a smartphone if you're in a pinch. Syncing cameras. This is huge. Do not forget to sync your cameras when you're shooting. If you don't sync your cameras, you'll be in for a world of hurt down the road when you're trying to stitch. Your shot could even be completely useless if you don't sync your cameras properly. There are two main ways that the computer can find sync on your cameras in post that you need to plan for when you're shooting. The first one, audio, is the one I like to do every single time. I like to verbally slate the beginning of each shot, or end if you forget, with a brief description of the shot you're about to capture. It doesn't need to have any kind of specific format or anything like that. Just say whatever makes sense to you, say it loudly, clearly, and close to the 360 rig. I also like to clap 5 to 6 times after I do the verbal slate, again loudly and next to the rig. The last thing I do before shooting is rapidly spin the rig back and forth about 5 to 6 times, like this. For me, this serves as my backup sync method. If for some reason the audio doesn't want to sync well, I've got that just in case. In my experience, audio syncing has given me the best results, so I bank on that working. And I have the rapid spinning sync option as a backup. Time lapses can look really awesome in 360 degrees. Be careful though, do not use the time lapse mode on the GoPros. Always shoot in video mode. The reason for this is when shooting in the time lapse mode, the time at which each camera snaps its image at whatever interval you set may not be perfectly synced. So your shot will be impossible to stitch well and could look pretty bad. With video, however, 80 frames per second obviously gives you a pretty good chance that you'll get a very good sync. Sync is king. If you have a good sync, your stitch will look so much better.